Close your eyes and imagine the roar of 50,000 people demanding blood, the smell of iron, sweat, and hot sand, the glint of a bronze blade grazing your throat. For many, the image of the gladiator is that of a slave athlete in the Roman Colosseum. But the reality is far darker, deeper, and more spiritual than Hollywood has led us to believe. The first clash of swords didn't occur in a grand arena before an emperor, but in the silence of a cemetery, by torchlight. Welcome to the true story of the gladiators, the men who turned death into the most lucrative spectacle in history. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. To understand these warriors, we must go back to the 3rd century before Christ. At that time, Rome was a young republic still absorbing the traditions of its neighbors, the Etruscans and the Campanians. The earliest combats weren't called games. They were called munera, meaning obligation or offering. They were private funerary rites. The ancient Romans believed that human blood poured on the tomb of an illustrious man appeased the spirits of the dead and gave them strength in the afterlife. It wasn't a sport, it was a ritualized human sacrifice where 2 slaves fought to the death to honor the deceased. The first recorded combat in Rome took place in 264 before Christ, during the funeral of a nobleman named Junius Brutus Pera. His sons organized a fight between 3 pairs of slaves in the Forum Boarium, the city's cattle market. It was a small, almost intimate affair. But the Roman people were captivated. There was something about the courage of these men facing their fate that resonated with the Roman mindset of discipline and military valor. What began as a religious duty gradually transformed, decade after decade, into a tool of political propaganda. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean and captured thousands of prisoners of war from Carthage, Greece, and the Gallic tribes, the supply of strong, desperate men grew. Roman politicians realized that staging a munus not only honored their ancestors but also guaranteed them the votes of the plebs. By the 1st century before Christ, the games had lost almost all their sacred character, becoming the bread and circuses that would come to define the empire. The fear of the prisoner of war forced to fight for his life in a foreign land became the capital's favorite form of entertainment. But who were these men really? Initially, they were exclusively prisoners of war, criminals condemned to death or rebellious slaves. They were considered infamous, people without legal rights below even domestic slaves. Yet here we find one of the strangest paradoxes of Roman society. The gladiator was socially despised but worshipped like a rock star. They were men who lived on the border between life and death, and that aura of danger made them irresistible. Over time, the demand for better fighters led to the professionalization of the industry. Lanistas emerged entrepreneurs who bought slaves with physical potential to train them in specialized schools. These men were seen as human butchers, but they were immensely wealthy. The business was risky. A well-trained gladiator was an extremely expensive investment. If he died in his first fight, the lanista lost a fortune. Therefore, contrary to popular belief, the fights did not always end in death. Gladiators were financial assets that had to be protected until the spectacle truly proved worthwhile. The structure of the games became so complex that the Roman state itself had to intervene to limit expenses and the number of pairs, fearing that some politicians would use their armies of gladiators to stage coups. Julius Caesar, for example, went so far as to exhibit 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor in honor of his deceased father. The scale was so massive that the Roman Forum was no longer sufficient. A stage befitting the ambition of the Caesars was needed. In these early centuries, the gladiator learned that his life no longer belonged to him. Upon entering a gladiatorial school, he swore a terrible oath to endure being burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. This oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, transformed an ordinary man into property of the arena. The gladiator accepted his fate with a dignity the Romans called virtus. If he was to die, he had to do so without a cry, offering his throat to the victor with terrifying calm. That calm was the result of scientific training that would dispel any image of barbarism. They weren't mere brutes hacking at each other. They were surgeons of steel. Every movement was choreographed to maximize the audience's tension. The sacred origin had faded, but the mystique remained. The stage was set for the construction of the Colosseum and the emergence of elite schools, where death would become a work of art and slaves would become forbidden heroes. If you think a gladiator's life was constant torture in a dark dungeon, historical reality will surprise you. Once a man crossed the gates of the ludus or gladiator school, he ceased to be treated as a mere slave and became a high-value investment. The ludus was a cross between a maximum security prison, a military barracks, and a high-performance sports center. Here, under the watchful eye of the lanista, men were molded physically and mentally to survive the most demanding spectacle of the ancient world. The building was typically a rectangular structure with cells overlooking a central training courtyard. The most famous school of all was the Ludus Magnus, located right next to the Colosseum in Rome and connected to it by an underground tunnel. Entering it meant accepting a regime of absolute discipline. Gladiators were divided into groups according to their experience and skill level. Novices, called tiro, had to prove their worth before they could use metal weapons. First, they trained against a wooden post called a palace, repeating thrusts and parries thousands of times under the scorching sun, using wooden swords that weighed twice as much as a real one to strengthen their muscles. One of the biggest myths that science has recently debunked is the diet of these warriors. Thanks to the analysis of bones found in gladiatorial cemeteries in cities like Ephesus, we know they weren't the muscular, defined men we see in movies. Their diet was almost exclusively vegetarian, based on barley and legumes, which earned them the nickname hordeari, or barley eaters. Why this diet? Because carbohydrates generated a thick layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat wasn't a sign of neglect, but rather strategic protection. It allowed superficial cuts in the arena to bleed spectacularly without damaging vital organs or deep muscles, prolonging the spectacle without the gladiator dying immediately. In addition to their diet, the gladiators received the best medical care of the time. The Lanistas employed the finest physicians, including the renowned Galen, who had been a gladiator physician in Pergamon before joining the imperial court. These doctors were experts in traumatology and suturing. Gladiators had access to masseurs, personal trainers, and hot baths. A healthy, well-fed gladiator was a more profitable one. However, this care came at a psychological price. The gladiator knew that all this attention was merely to ensure that his death, when it came, would be before a crowd and not in a cell from a poorly treated infection. Life in the ludus also forged strange bonds. Despite knowing they might one day have to kill each other, gladiators formed collegia, or unions. These groups ensured that if a fellow gladiator died in the arena, he received a proper burial and his family was compensated. There was a sense of professional brotherhood, a shared honor among the condemned. Gladiators often referred to their fellow gladiators as brothers in arms, sharing a subculture with its own slang and internal hierarchies. But not everyone in the ludus was a slave or a prisoner. Over time, the figure of the auctoratus emerged, free Roman citizens who renounced their rights to become gladiators. Why would someone voluntarily choose the life of a condemned man? For fame and money. The prize for a victory in the arena could be equivalent to a Roman soldier's annual salary. For a man drowning in debt or an adventurer with nothing to lose, the arena was the only quick path to social advancement. These volunteers were often the most dangerous, for they fought by choice, not by obligation. Within the school, specialization was key. Not everyone trained the same. The lanista and the doctores, veteran trainers who were usually retired gladiators, observed each man's physique. If you were short and stocky, you were trained as a heavy murmillo. If you were agile and tall, you could become a retiarius. This technical division was fundamental to creating balanced fights. They weren't looking for a quick victory, but rather for the combat to be a prolonged dance of death that would keep the crowd roaring with excitement. The ludus was, in essence, a factory of forbidden heroes. Upon leaving for his first fight, the gladiator was no longer the person who entered. He had been stripped of his former identity and rechristened with an imposing stage name like Hermes, Spiculus, or Victor. He was ready to enter the arena, drenched in oil, his armor gleaming, his heart pounding to the rhythm of imperial drums. But before facing the crowd, he had to familiarize himself with his tools of the trade, the weapons and armor designed to transform pain into art. In the world of gladiators, variety wasn't a matter of aesthetics, but of entertainment engineering. The Romans were masters at creating balanced fights where brute force met agility and heavy defense faced speed. Each type of gladiator, known as an armatura, had a set of weapons and armor specifically designed to exploit the opponent's weaknesses. This wasn't a street fight, it was a bloody chess game where each piece had limited moves and unique strengths. The most iconic and representative gladiator of Roman power was the murmillo. This warrior was the tank of the arena. He was equipped with a heavy bronze helmet adorned with a fish-shaped crest, a large rectangular shield called a scutum, similar to those used by the legions, and a short sword known as a gladius. His right arm was protected by a manica, an armor of leather or metal scales, but his torso remained bare. The murmillo relied on his strength and the protection of his shield, waiting for the precise moment to deliver a deadly thrust while standing as firm as a rock. Facing the heavy murmillo was the Thracian. He was the favorite of those who valued technique and speed. The Thracian carried a small, square shield called a parmula, and his most fearsome weapon was the sica, a curved sword designed to loop around the opponent's shield and stab them in the back or sides. He wore high greaves that protected both legs up to the thighs. A fight between a murmillo and a Thracian was the classic duel between immovable defense and sinuous attack, a struggle that could last a long time due to the skill of both combatants. However, the most famous and symbolically charged confrontation was that of the retiarius against the secutor. This was the ultimate battle between net and sword. The retiarius was the only gladiator who fought almost without armor, wearing only a shoulder guard called a galerus and a kilt. His weapons were a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger. The retiarius represented the fisherman, agility, and freedom. His strategy consisted of maintaining distance, attempting to ensnare his opponent in the net, and then stabbing him with the trident. His natural enemy, the secutor, was literally designed to be his nightmare. The secutor, whose name means the pursuer, wore a smooth, round helmet without ridges to prevent the retiarius's net from snagging on it. His eye holes were minimal to protect him from the trident's points. Though this drastically limited his vision and breathing, it was a psychological battle. The secutor had to advance relentlessly, enduring the heat and lack of air inside the helmet while the retiarius danced around him, searching for an opening. If the secutor caught the fisherman, the fight was over in seconds. If the retiarius managed to tire the secutor, death was slow and painful. There were other less common but equally fascinating types. The provocateur was the only one who wore a metal breastplate, and he usually fought against others of his kind to open the games. The Esidarius fought from a Celtic-style war chariot, while the Dimachurus was a specialist in fighting with two swords simultaneously, a discipline that required astonishing muscular coordination and was highly appreciated by the more technically minded spectators. One detail that is often forgotten is that gladiators almost always fought bare-chested. This wasn't due to a lack of resources, but rather by design. The bare chest increased the risk of visible injuries that the public wanted to see, but it also allowed the loser, in the event of a final execution, to offer his neck or chest without obstruction. The weaponry wasn't designed to fully protect the man, but to prolong the drama of the combat. The weapons were true works of art. The swords were forged from high-quality steel, and the helmets were decorated with reliefs of gods, winged victories, or hunting scenes. An elite gladiator carried a small fortune in equipment. The weight of this armor was considerable. A murmillo could carry more than 15 or 20 kilos of gear under the scorching Roman midday sun. This made the arena an extreme test of cardiovascular endurance, where many men collapsed from exhaustion before receiving a single cut. All this equipment was stored in the school's armamentarium and only issued to the gladiators on the day of combat. Seeing these armed men, each representing a different culture conquered by Rome, the audience felt as if they were witnessing the empire in miniature. Every clash of metal, every glint of a helmet in the sun, was a reminder of Rome's power over the known world. But the weapons were only half the spectacle. The real drama began when the warriors emerged from the tunnel and stepped into the arena, facing fate head-on and the capricious will of thousands of spectators hungry for glory. Then like, subscribe, and share. For a Roman citizen, attending the games was not simply watching a fight. It was a social, political, and sensory event that lasted all day. The spectacle, known as the editio, was meticulously organized to maintain tension from dawn till dusk. The arena, covered with fine sand to absorb blood. In fact, the word arena comes from the Latin arena, meaning sand became the center of the universe. Beneath it, the hypergeum, a labyrinth of tunnels, elevators, and trapdoors, was a hive of activity where hundreds of slaves and technicians worked in the dark to make the miracles happen on the surface. The day began with the venatio, or animal hunts. Rome brought exotic beasts from all corners of the empire: lions from North Africa, tigers from the Caspian Sea, bears from Scotland, and elephants from India. The venatores, specialists in animal combat, entered the arena to demonstrate the Roman civilization's dominion over wild nature. Thousands of animals died in a single morning. It is said that more than 9,000 beasts were sacrificed for the inauguration of the Colosseum. The crowd roared at the exoticism and the danger, while the scenery magically changed thanks to hydraulic platforms that made forests or deserts spring up from the arena floor. At midday, the atmosphere shifted, becoming more somber. It was time for the meridiani, the executions of criminals and prisoners of war. Rome never missed an opportunity to make a public example of them. Some were thrown to wild beasts unarmed. Others were forced to reenact Greek myths in which the protagonist died a real death. These executions were seen by the elite as a time to go and eat, but for the common people, they were a stark reminder of what happened to those who defied the laws of the empire. However, all of this was merely an appetizer for the main course, which began as the sun started to set. The climactic moment arrived with the solemn procession called the Pompa. The gladiators entered the arena dressed in gold and purple cloaks, parading before the box of the emperor or the publisher who financed the games. This is where the famous phrase "Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant," "Hail Caesar, those about to die salute you," originated. Although an iconic phrase, historians believe it wasn't uttered at every combat, but rather as a specific greeting during a naumachia or naval battle. Even so, it reflected the warrior's absolute submission to the power of the state. Gladiator fights were followed with almost academic attention. They weren't chaotic brawls. There were referees known as summa rudis, dressed in white robes and armed with rods to ensure the rules were followed. If a gladiator was too passive, the referee would order slaves to whip him or prod him with red-hot irons to force him to fight. The audience wagered fortunes and shouted technical advice, analyzing each thrust as if it were a modern professional sport. The most persistent myth from this period is that of the thumbs-down gesture. In reality, the gesture was called pollis verso, meaning turned thumb. We don't know with absolute certainty which direction indicated death, but many experts suggest that the thumb extended toward the throat or chest signaled execution, while the thumb tucked inside the fist. The pollis compresso signified pardon or missio. The final decision didn't rest with the public, but with the emperor or the editor, although they almost always followed the will of the masses to avoid riots. When a gladiator fell and the verdict was death, the final ritual was awe-inspiring. The loser was not to beg or tremble. He had to kneel and offer his neck, grasping the victor's thigh for balance. The victor plunged his sword into the collarbone, searching for the heart. Once dead, a servant disguised as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, entered and struck the body with a mallet to ensure he wasn't faking, while another, disguised as Mercury, touched the corpse with a red-hot iron. The bodies were carried out through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of Libitina, goddess of funerals. In the stripping chamber, their armor was removed and the blood cleaned away for the next combat. Meanwhile, the arena was raked and covered with fresh sand to erase any trace of the previous carnage. The spectacle had to go on. At the end of the day, the victors emerged through the Porta Triumphalis, carrying palms of victory and silver bowls filled with gold coins, having become the most famous and sought-after men in the city, while the scent of incense and blood wafted over a Rome returning home satisfied. For the average Roman citizen, the gladiator represented the ultimate contradiction of their society. Legally, these men were infamous, citizens of the lowest rank, without rights and considered property. But socially, they were the empire's greatest mass idols. The best gladiators were the equivalent of today's footballers or movie stars. Their names appeared in graffiti on the walls of Pompeii and Rome, where they were described as the size of the girls or the master of the night. This fame wasn't just sporting admiration, it was an obsession that transcended all social barriers. It is said that women of the Roman aristocracy, even the wives of senators, paid fortunes to spend a night with a famous gladiator. But the fascination reached extremes that would seem disturbing to us today. The blood and sweat of a victorious gladiator were collected by the lanistas and sold as luxury goods. The sweat, mixed with oils and perfumes, was sold as an extremely expensive cosmetic that women used to improve their complexion, believing it contained the warrior's vital force and virility. It was even believed that drinking the warm blood of a gladiator recently killed in the arena could cure epilepsy. The fighter's body was seen as a talisman of pure energy. However, behind this paper-thin fame, the gladiator desired only one thing: the rudis. The rudis was a small wooden sword that the emperor or the game's organizer bestowed upon a gladiator as a symbol of his freedom. Receiving the rudis meant that you no longer had to fight for your life. You could retire, often as a wealthy man, and become a trainer or even a businessman. Many famous gladiators, despite gaining their freedom, chose to continue fighting because they knew no other life or because the adrenaline of the arena was a drug they couldn't escape. But not all gladiators accepted their fate with submission. The history of gladiators has one name that shook the very foundations of the Roman Republic: Spartacus. In 73 before Christ, this gladiator of Thracian origin, tired of the abuses at Lentulus Batiatus's school in Capua, led a mass escape. What began as a revolt of 70 men armed with kitchen utensils grew into an army of over 120,000 people, including slaves and disaffected peasants. Spartacus was not just a brute, he was a brilliant strategist. He defeated several Roman legions using guerrilla tactics and the military knowledge many of his fellow gladiators had acquired before their capture. For 2 years, the rebel gladiators humiliated Rome on its own soil, proving that men trained for entertainment were more than capable of destroying professional armies. The rebellion was finally crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, and 6,000 of Spartacus's followers were crucified along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome, as a grim warning. This revolt forever changed how the Romans viewed their gladiators. They began to see them with a respect tinged with profound terror. Despite the threat of rebellion, the games continued. Instead, they became more extravagant. Some emperors took their obsession to extremes, such as the infamous Commodus, who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. Commodus would descend into the arena to fight, though his matches were entirely rigged. His opponents used wooden weapons or surrendered immediately to the emperor, who collected astronomical sums from the public treasury for each victory. This degradation of the gladiator's honor by an emperor was seen by the aristocracy as a sign of Rome's irreversible decline. The fame of gladiators also extended to women. Although less common, female gladiators, known as ludia, did exist. Archaeological evidence, such as a bronze statuette in Hamburg and reliefs at Halicarnassus, confirms that women also fought in the arena, often against other women or in nighttime spectacles by torchlight to enhance the exoticism. However, their participation was always controversial and was eventually banned by Emperor Septimius Severus in 200 after Christ, who feared that the presence of women in the arena would undermine the dignity of the female gender and the games themselves. The gladiator was the quintessential forbidden hero. He embodied Roman military valor but lived in infamy. He was the man everyone wanted to be and no one wanted to invite to their table. At the height of his career, a gladiator could have everything except his legal freedom. That constant tension between the glitter of glory and the shadow of death was what kept the arena alive for centuries. But as the empire changed and a new faith began to spread through the streets of Rome, the days of the blood games were numbered. The greatest show on earth was about to face an enemy that could not be defeated with a curved sword or a trident. As the Roman Empire moved into the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, the roar of the Colosseum began to fade. Two main factors sealed the fate of gladiators: economics and religion. Maintaining the games was immensely expensive, and an empire beset by barbarian invasions and inflation could no longer afford to sacrifice thousands of men and animals for mere entertainment. Furthermore, the rise of Christianity changed the morality of the time. For the new church leaders, the spectacle of men killing each other for pleasure was an abomination that insulted God's creation. Emperor Constantine the Great was the first to enact laws restricting the games, although the tradition was so deeply ingrained in the people that the fights continued clandestinely or on a limited basis for decades. The final blow came in 404 after Christ. According to tradition, a monk named Telemachus jumped into the Colosseum arena to try to separate two gladiators, shouting for the carnage to stop. The crowd, enraged by the interruption, stoned him to death. This act moved Emperor Honorius, who definitively banned gladiatorial combat in the city of Rome. With the closure of schools and the banning of games, gladiators disappeared from history, but their image was seared into humanity's memory. The Colosseum remained a stone skeleton, a reminder of an era where life was worth less than applause. Yet the concept of the hero who fights against all odds to win his freedom lives on. From football stadiums to mixed martial arts arenas, our fascination with individual combat and physical sacrifice is a direct echo of what transpired in the Roman arenas. Today, gladiators are more than just dead slaves. They are symbols of human resilience. They taught us that even in the most terrible conditions, a person can find dignity and honor. The history of the arena is the story of our own nature, a mixture of cruelty and heroism, of blood and glory. Rome's forbidden heroes have left the arena, but their legend still resonates every time an athlete faces their destiny under the glare of the lights, reminding us that in the end, we are all fighting our own battle before the eyes of the world. Next, like, subscribe and share. Until the next one.